Welcome to Michigan Reimagined, a Spotlight podcast. And here's your host, Chris Buck.
So, like most states, Michigan is fighting hard to recover from the pandemic and attract population growth after years of shrinking. Many are worried that a lack of housing options and just a general alignment of community goals might slow Michigan's quest for new residents and vibrancy. Here to talk about his personal journey for knowledge and his collaboration in compiling data is the president of TA Forsberg, Mr. Brent Forsberg. Welcome back, Brent. You're a regular, usual suspect.
Yeah, well, thank you again for having me, Chris. And yeah, this is a very exciting topic. And just to get started, the one thing I want to say is Michigan as a whole is in better shape than a lot of the rest of the country. So, we're starting from not the bottom of having the largest pressure on housing. So at least from there, it's
right on.
Yeah.
Okay, good. Well, that's good to hear because, I talk to a lot of people. I mean, that's why I do this podcast. And one of the things that I have noticed is there's a lot of self-disparaging Michiganders, right? And they may not even know it, right? We are our own worst enemy. Every other state, and if you just ask someone on the street, tell me about a state you think is cool or is doing really well, they'll tell you, Tennessee's kind of hot and North Carolina's cool. And boy, Arizona and Georgia and Atlanta and all these places are cooler, or Chicago. But I'll tell you what, every one of those places has monumental hurdles to clear. And Michigan's no different. We've got a lot of fantastic resources and assets and all that kind of stuff. But for some reason, Michiganders tend to lead with a little bit more with an apology than a pride level. And so I think we need to. So I'm happy that you started out by talking about we're in better shape than a lot of other places, because we're going to talk a little bit about housing in this podcast. So anyway, just thank you for bringing that up.
It's true. We do tend to self-disparage a lot here. And I'll put this state up against any. And everybody has their assets. And let's face it, we have water.
Yep.
And from anywhere in the state, you're no more than a couple miles from a great trail system, not to mention the beauty of the trees, the agriculture. I mean, we have everything here and create one of the best experiences for living in the country. We have one of the best value propositions. Now, with that and affordability compared to a lot of the country, we are affordable. And that's a blessing and a curse, because when we have the inflation and things that we've seen in the cost on materials, it makes it hard to build because the living expenses for the houses don't cover that experience. So that's where we're seeing that little bit of a gap right now in housing where we've slowed down on the building. So take the Lansing area right now, so I've got those numbers on the top of my head. We got about a 2.5 month housing supply. A stable market would be 4.5 to 6. So we're still feeling pressure, but there still is stock. And this region and a lot of the areas in the state are working on forward-thinking housing plans. We've got a lot going on in industry right now, and we're seeing growth in Michigan. We're seeing growth, in the jobs coming back from overseas as we're dealing with the supply chain changes that COVID put us in. So it's going to continue that pressure. But you're seeing also that communities are starting to say, okay, what is our housing plan moving forward? Where is smart growth? How do we use our infrastructure better? These were conversations not happening 20 years ago, because we were looking at, managing growth and expansion, because that was the model that we'd been on since World War II.
Right.
So we're starting to see that change, and that's a good thing, because now we're having the conversation of how do we use our infrastructure better? And we've seen go anywhere in Michigan, what's the biggest joke is our roads.
Right. Yeah. But hey, you can't complain about the bad roads and complain about the construction, because I'll tell you what, every road seems to be getting fixed right now. Yeah. And I'm happy about it. Every time I want to grumble, I'm like, think about how great this road's going to be in just a little bit. So
absolutely. It's the same thing with our seasons, right? You can't complain about all 4 seasons, but you just, it's going to be better in the end. And same thing with our seasons. If it's not what you want in 3 months,
right,
it'll be here.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. I don't even get me started on weather, because that's one of the biggest disparaging things that we do. It's like, it gets cold in Michigan. Yeah. No kidding. It gets cold it also gets cold in Norway. It gets cold in Minnesota, but these, Minneapolis and Norway are very cool towns. They just maximize the fun of winter.
Yeah. Well, and that's the perfect point is they embrace it. And that's one thing we're even starting to see here. You're seeing a lot more Winterfest. We've had some of Michigan. I mean, you go anywhere in Michigan, there's a Summerfest somewhere any given weekend.
Right.
And we're starting to see that in the winter now too. People are saying, you know what? it's here. Let's embrace it. There's lots of fun things that can happen. So, and that builds back into the experience of that value proposition of what our state is and what our communities have to offer.
Right. And I moved here in 2008 to Michigan for the first time, really didn't spend any time here, but from Philadelphia and from Seattle. And, I knew that going up north in Michigan, as I was learning what Michigan was all about, because I didn't live anywhere near here, I knew that going up north was a summer thing, and the water and the energy and the housing, and people have vacation homes and cottages and all that kind of stuff. And I went to tour these facilities that I was overseeing in a completely unrelated industry. And it happened to be in the winter, and it happened to be in a very lean winter, lack of snow. Mm-hmm. And the local, who was my employee, was touring me around to these locations, was just saying, we're getting crushed. I mean, maybe you don't understand it, but like the businesses here relying on the winter economy is maybe 60 to 70% of the value of what they rely on for the summer economy. Yeah. So the snowmobiling and the ice fishing and the cross country skiing and the downhill skiing and the fat tire, mountain bikes and all these things that we do in the winter. If we don't have snow, those people don't come. So the grocery stores and the hotels and and the gas stations and all these people, the subways and all those places, suffer because they don't have that tourism. So embracing winter is a real thing, and maybe more so up north, but I don't see the embracing of winter down here as far as the complaints and that kind of stuff are concerned. Yeah,
it's coming, and cities are setting up winter fests and things to try to keep that energy through the winter here versus, just allowing us to stay at home and get cabin fever.
Exactly. So. Right. You were talking a little off mic about a conversation you had or a presentation. I forget what you were at a land bank meeting or whatever it was. And you talked about just from a broader perspective before we really dive into housing, just kind of getting aligned, right?
Yeah.
Like setting up our goals or kind of where are we headed and making sure that different disciplines are kind of almost, I would necessarily aren't always going to be in agreement, but talk a little bit about what you mean by that.
Absolutely. As a developer, the first thing that we look at is how do we align the values of place and people? So I want to frame this conversation in when we're building, designing, planning, this is about the human experience. This is about how we live, how we create that sense of belonging place that people inherently want. We're a social species.
Right.
So for so many years in planning, we go straight to the use and we go to traffic counts and we forget what we're supposed to be doing with this. And it's supposed to be creating a place people want to be, that they want to meet other people in, that they want to further their careers, their education, have the places that are fun and exciting for recreation. So that's the beginning, and it begins with aligning what are the values. So what we look at is values from the global. So you have at that level the UN 17 principles right down to any given region that talks about affordability of housing, that talks about creating fun places to be. So you start getting down to those levels that can then be action items at that local neighborhood. So when we look at what's happened in Michigan over time, I use Ford as the example, is early 20th century, when Henry Ford made the $5 a day wage, he did two things. So he set us on the course and changed the complete design of the world and what housing was going to be, because we now are going on an auto-centric model, so we were able to spread out, decentralize that. We saw accelerate past World War II. But he also set the middle class. So he made the workforce be able to have an experience that had never been seen before in the world with that wage increase. So as we kind of built that up and went through, he did that because he knew those folks were going to buy his cars, but he also knew it would reduce the turnover and all the other pieces that came with it. Over time, as Ford became a global operation, their values didn't change. It just wasn't aligned with the community anymore as they were becoming competitive and having to move their workforce and things. So what we look at is how do we keep values aligned and keep that pipeline going? And that's one thing that I think we missed in the 20th century. And we're really seeing that change now. Look at all the business growth and people looking at coming in. We kind of got complacent and let that pipeline just kind of die off. And we're seeing it with the small business push that started in the mid-2000s and what you're doing here with Michigan Reimagine, putting the spotlight on that. And that's what's going to help Michigan in the future, I think, be one of the top growth areas for the next 50 years.
Now, I think a lot of our listeners would probably talk about developers, whether it's office buildings or mixed-use projects, apartments, housing, as kind of cold, sterile, what's the product? where's their acreage? How can I rape and pillage, build something, make a bunch of money and leave, and just build what the people tell me they want and then get out? Because once I sell it, it's not that important to me anymore. You're painting a picture as a developer that that's not the way to think. But would you say that the industry is spending more of this time collaborating and thinking? I think of you as a unique thought leader I think you put this ahead of the profits and how do I just build in mass and make X amount per unit, and the compounding effects of that will make me a wealthy man and I just move on to the next place. So talk to me a little bit about the transition of the industry and what percentage maybe were we in this other world, and how many developers are thinking now maybe a little bit more like you?
Well, I think you're seeing a real shift in the industry. And two things. First of all, my company model is value add hold. So when we build something that's going to be a for rent, whether residential, commercial, industrial, we never plan on selling. So that allows us to have a little different look of how we adjust ROI, because now we take in long-term operating expenses, long-term capital expenses into the model. Then you have developers that are the build, stabilize, collect the fees, and flip. So that's a different model from what my company's model is. So it changes the perspective. But you're also seeing, even in that side of it, as people are more sophisticated in what they want. So just building a white box with some cabinets and a spot to put a bed isn't going to cut it anymore. You either A, have to have the amenities of walkable space, right, or B, if you're in an area where those amenities aren't there, you got to build them in, because that's what the capital market is. There's too much competition. So even those that maybe are 100% numbers driven are still have to look at these elements of experience in what they're doing. And a lot of it comes into how we've done the financing, because everything that we do is driven by the financing model. We're all beholden to the banks in our industry.
Yeah, good point.
So when they put the restrictions on, even if we got a cool idea, sometimes we can't do it, and it's frustrating. And that's something that we're looking at too, which is why I'm getting my PhD at University of Denver.
I was going to talk about that a little bit. So what are you studying, and why is that I mean, to me, you know everything you need to know, which is obviously a foolish thing. As I even say that, I realize that that's not right. Yeah. But you're one of the most impressive thought leaders that I know, and I mean that sincerely. And for you to go on to a PhD and almost as a distraction to the great work that you're doing in the community, talk about why you're doing it and what's your ROI.
Yeah. It's about changing the entire system that we're within. And it's a very simple principle that Warren Buffett brings up of, that when the opportunity's there, you have to align the system to it. So this gets to, what is the system scale? Financing is a national scale. So when we look at areas in growth, and especially in the Midwest, that a lot of the coasts call us the flyover states, we don't have that constant pipeline of investment money. And the tools that are available for financing don't necessarily align with what Midwest values are for the types of mixed use experiences and things that we have. So if you take, and this is oversimplified, but just a quick example, you take a 30-year FHA non-recourse loan on multifamily that the federal government restricts us to less than 10% of the floor space commercial. Okay. We get this long-term loan, we can amortize long periods. If you're mixed use, you're now on recourse, which means that you're fully liable for the loan. And then you have to refi every 3 to 5 years because of the balloons and things. Every $500,000 of loans in the United States on the 30-year versus the mixed use, every 15 years, that small business loses $142,000 of equities when you do the fees and the compounding and everything. Okay. So this is money extracted out that could be invested back to our communities. So what I'm looking at is getting the research, and I knew I couldn't get on my own. I needed a university behind me and a couple universities to put together the research packages to show that if we want to build, and we need to change the risk models that the banks are using and work through that as we decide what the next 50 years look like.
Wow. That's fantastic. Okay, good. Keep going. Let me know if you need any lunch money as you go off to school. Yeah. No, that's great. What's your timeline? When do you expect to get your PhD? I want to call you Dr. Forsberg the next time I bring you on.
Yeah, my kids have said they will never use that, by the way.
Oh, which come on, Doc.
I know, that's what I said. It's probably 3.5 years from now by the time I get my dissertation done. Okay. And everything. So research has started now. The first research project will be kicking off next year on broadness of capacity in neighborhood using smart growth principles.
Okay. Got it. Great. I want all of that.
Yeah.
So, housing. Again, we're actually starting to bump up against time. So in the next 3, 4, 5 minutes, let's talk a little bit about housing.
Yeah.
You talked about supply and, and all that kind of stuff, but I know that there's a lot of work being done to try to attract new companies, right? Job creation. You've got all the with all the new federal incentives out there and all the innovation. We're going semiconductors and chips, for these vehicles that are parked and trying to get that domesticated. And then we've got all these battery plants for the future of electric vehicles and then other ththings too. But those two things are very hot. Yeah. And Michigan is fighting hard as the place to put the world on wheels to land some of these things. And I'm hearing reports of these guys are bringing 3,000 new jobs and 5,000 new jobs and 2,000 new jobs. And based on my math, we need inbound talent, right? Yep. And so these developing the housing and the places and all the communities and the Winterfests and everything we've already discussed, in my opinion, the elephant in the room, A, is talent. Are we going to attract the talent if these companies invest and they have these jobs? Are we going to get the people that want those jobs? And I think we will. But then if we're successful, which is the expectation, where the hell are we going to put these people, right? Is there enough housing stock? If we were to grow 1 million people from 10 million to 11 million people in the next 5 years, do we have the place for those 1 million people to land?
Well, the beautiful thing is we have the place.
Right. The room.
The room is here.
Right.
What we're working on right now with the home builders and a lot of other groups is getting the capacity. So it's alignment of capacity with the needs. So, and that's just building the conversations. When we look at that, Michigan is more than capable of building enough housing. We've done it in the past. You go back to 98 to 2005, we were on track or overpacing that high growth period we had at that point. So we can do it again. The infrastructure's here, the production builders, the commercial contractors, our labor forces around the state can ramp up, and it's the talent training, and it's alignment of the talent. I don't know if it's still the same statistic, but Michigan State used to be the number 2 brain drain in the country. So we have talent here. Is it aligned with what the workforce is? Those are the conversations we have to have.
Right.
And then from the affordability standpoint, we attack that from 2 ways. You have technology, which means we find ways to be more efficient, use new technologies to lower the price. But then it's capacity as well. By having these high-paying jobs offers the opportunity for the developers to work within that and pairing with these companies to find out what's the demographics, what's the housing needs of their employee stock. Then we can start designing and having the conversation with the local municipalities. And Michigan being a home rule state, that means that's about every 6 miles, which is a good thing moving forward because it's going to allow us to have that diversification of housing across the state. So it's building that conversation, and it's happening now. That's the good part. I mean, the developers getting together, the economic development has publicly stated now that housing is an economic driver.
Right.
Which 10 years ago, some of us that were saying that was like, well, housing is adjacent to it, but it's not an economic driver. Well, as this new workforce coming in, their first question is, where am I going to live?
Right.
So it is now. And that's exciting because that means that conversation is going to shift quickly.
Fantastic. Okay. So what's next? I mean, how can people get involved? I mean, we do need to wrap up. So, but what's, how do people find you, first of all? TA Forsberg.
LansingRealEstate.com. But it's having the conversations locally because everything happens at the local level.
Got it. So getting involved with your local government, volunteer for like an EDC board or
all of it,
or pay attention to the public meetings.
Yes.
Fantastic. Brent Forsberg, we could go on for days. I look forward to getting you back, Doc.
Thanks.
Take care.